Hey guys, thanks for joining me today for this oil painting tutorial. If you haven't already, please check the description box below. It'll have a list of all the supplies I used as well as a link to my social media accounts that you can follow all of my paintings on, as well as upcoming video updates. So I'm starting by mapping this background in using a larger flat brush, and I'm just looking to get a coverage. I'll do more layering on this as it progresses once this layer dries. But for this particular day, I am just looking to get enough of the paint on there to where I can let that dry and move on to the next layer. So once I put this on, I go through with my same flat brush and just kind of soften the strokes just to make sure there's no ridges in the paint. Once I complete that, I'm going in petal by petal and putting in my lights and my darks. I want to make sure I work from left to right so that I have a place to rest my hand. However, you'll see later in the video I still put my palm in it, and that's inevitable. So for the shadow areas of the petals, I'm using Alizarin Crimson and Violet, and I'm just adjusting those as I go. I'm not looking for it to be exact. Like I said, I'm going to do more layering on this, so I just want to get coverage of the canvas so that I can go back through and deepen my values and lighten my values even more with the next layers. Sometimes when you're working on roses, this one isn't quite as intricate, but when you're working on roses, it can be difficult to keep track of the petals. And doing it petal by petal really helps you keep track of a certain area so that you don't get lost as to how many petals goes where. If you're jumping all over the canvas, it might be a little bit more trickier to kind of follow where each petal is supposed to be. And I chose to leave the white on the rose. I chose to leave that out and not block in the entire background because I wanted the vibrancy to really show through. And if I had painted it all dark first, I wouldn't have been able to get the vibrancy with the reds that I wanted. So just continuing with a small flat brush, blocking all of my highlights and shadows in, paying close attention to my reference photo. And I want to make sure I am following the form of each petal. Whichever way they're turning, I'm making sure my brush stroke is going that way. And I'm not concerned with any of the coloring right now. That does get adjusted quite a bit towards the end. I end up doing quite a bit of glazing on top of this once this has dried. But I'm just looking for the values. I just want to get the general shapes in. That way it can dry so I can move on to the next layer. And for this lighter color, I'm using Magenta and Violet. And you'll see that I go over it with a red. However, I end up going back over it with more magenta to give it more of a translucent appearance. For the majority of the painting, I did stick to this small flat brush that I used until the final layers where I did go in with a liner brush and a round brush. This allowed me to be able to get into some of the smaller areas as well as get more coverage. There will be a link to this reference photo that I used in the description box below. I did change it quite a bit. I upped the vibrancy on it just so that it would translate into a painting a little bit better. And I put magenta and some titanium white on this petal here, and I ended up deciding I didn't like how that was translating. That's when I really upped the vibrancy and decided I'm just gonna paint how I want it to be painted and stray away from the reference photo for that area. And I'm just adjusting, making sure before I let this dry, I want to make sure I get my values where I want them. So you'll see I'm going in with some Zinc White and lightening some areas. And it looks really rough right now. This is one of those paintings that it's going to look worse before it starts to look better. It really comes together in the final layers. Now I'm just taking a blender brush, which is actually a makeup brush, and I'm softening out all of those harsh lines that I see. So now this is the next day, and with all those previous layers I had mixed in some Galkyd mediums, so this allowed it to dry fairly quickly. So for this next day I am adjusting my values even more, and I'm able to get them a little richer and a little deeper. And because it is dry, I'm able to rest my hand on the canvas. For the highlighted petals, I'm using a mixture of some orange and some Alizarin Crimson, as well as regular crimson. But any red will do. The oranges, because I'm using magenta, the oranges seem to go really well together with the magenta. So I do suggest highlighting in the orange, and that will maintain a lot of the vibrancy. If you were to add just white to the crimson or anything, you would get a really washed out pink, and that doesn't necessarily create a vibrant color. With each layer, I'm kind of building up all of the detail. I'm not concerned with getting every exact representation of the detail at the moment, but I am adding a little bit because each layer is going to show through a little. A lot of when you're painting is just a push and pull method. So you're pushing, you know, you're pushing your darks even darker, and you're pulling your lights even lighter. And it's really just a process of, until you're happy with it is when you stop. A lot of paintings that I see of beginner artists, they did a great job, but they haven't pushed it or pulled it far enough. They're almost there, but they're just not quite there. They quit too soon. So just work at it until you're happy about with the results. So again, just adjusting my values with that same shadow color. I did mix in, for these deeper, darker areas, I did mix in a tiny bit of black. Not too much because I didn't want it to overpower it. And these petals do have veins going through them, so I wanted to make sure I just kind of gave the impression that there was some there. I wasn't going to paint in every single vein that I saw. Just wanted to give it the illusion that there's detail there. And you can see I'm going back over with some of the orange and covering up a lot of that magenta. And I find it best when I'm oil painting to lay down the color and then go back through with a blending brush or just another clean brush and smooth out any harsh lines. That seems to work best and prevents you from creating a muddy color. So that's the same technique that I'm using to just apply the color with a flat brush, and then you'll see I go in with a clean brush and smooth some of that out before I let it dry. And I wanted to make these highlights really bright, a lot brighter than what they will be because I'm going to be glazing color over it. And this is just titanium white that I'm putting on. Because there's color underneath it, it's picking up all the different tones that are underneath it. So you can see the shadow color underneath the petal. It's more of a magenta color. When I added that white, it really popped that up. And this is just a clean brush that I'm going back over and smoothing out some lines, leaving some harsh lines and leaving some soft lines. Just getting it to a point where I'm ready to let it dry so that I can glaze the next day. While I'm letting that dry, I wanted to make sure I just go ahead and roughly block in my stem and my leaves. Not really concerned with any of the coloring. It's going to be really loose to begin with, just so that I can get coverage on the canvas and let that dry. Just mapping out all of my shadows and my highlight areas. So I did decide to go ahead and do another layer on the background. That will allow me to better judge my highlights and my shadow areas within the flower if I can get that background color the color that I want. So I'm using the same mixture, but you can see how much darker it is now with a second coat on there. And one thing to keep in mind when you have such vibrant subjects and you really want to accentuate that, wherever your highlight areas are, you want to make sure you're adding dark next to that. So you can see to the left of the painting, it is very dark, and then you can see right now I'm adding in kind of a misty, lighter color, and that's because that's the shadow areas come off to the lower right hand side, and to the left is my brightest highlights. So in order to accentuate those areas, I want to make sure I'm putting the dark next to the light and the light next to the dark. So now this is the next day when it has dried, and I'm going to be glazing over, and I'm doing a really thin layer, and I have a lot of Galkyd medium mixed in with this to make it even more transparent, but you can see how much more vibrant it is altogether. Just by adding those glazes, it allows some of the detail that we put in with the white before, it allows some of that to show through, but really softens it enough that it becomes realistic looking. And if there's an area that maybe I had too much coverage on, my paint was a little bit too thick, I can just take my finger or a paper towel and gently wipe it off, and it will allow those underlayers to kind of show through a little bit more. When you're glazing, you want to make sure that you're mixing it with the medium to make it more transparent, or using very, very light hand with it. You don't want to add a lot of paint to your brush. And you also want to make sure you're using transparent colors. And I'm using a lot of the same highlight and shadow colors that I used in the previous layers, but because I laid that white down, they're much more vibrant. Just continuing to adjust all of my values. I've got my lights just about where I want them for this session, but I really want to push my darks as far as I can get them. Really give it that 3D realism effect. And I'm adding even more orange now. I want to really up the vibrancy on all of the highlighted areas. And you'll see I add some white to that in just a little bit, just to give it a little bit more dimension to the painting. So here's where I started adding some white to the orange, and this is just going to add a little bit more detail, brighten up a few areas, give it that little extra pop, and I even pull that even lighter in a little bit. So now I'm working on my leaves, and rose leaves don't tend to be just green. They do have a lot of red and browns in them, so I wanted to make sure I pulled some of those reds from the petals into the leaves. The Alizarin Crimson is mostly what I used as for the reds, and then some cooler and warmer greens. And I didn't add a ton of detail to the stem and the leaves because I wanted the main focus to be on the petals and the vibrancy of the petals, that I really didn't want to steer the eye too much towards the stem and the leaves. So by not adding that much detail to those, it really pushes your eye to whatever's brightest and more detailed. So now this is the final layer that I'm doing to the background. And this just really helps sharpen up the image, kind of cleaning around all of the areas that I had painted, maybe went a little over my petals. This just really helps sharpen everything up and get the background exactly how I want it. And I go in with a smaller brush around the petals, and then I take the larger flat brush and fill in the rest and then merge the two together just to get rid of any harsh lines that I would see. I'm using a small round brush to get a little bit more detail on the leaves and the stem. But like I said, I didn't want to add too much. I just want enough to make it believable. So as I sat there, I looked at it and I thought, man, the color is right, but I feel like I'm not getting enough detail in there, and realized that I had lost a lot of the veins in my flower petals. So I went back through with a liner brush and some of the shadow color and just kind of randomly put in some lines. And you'll see I go back through with a blender brush and soften some of that out, but it really helped add some realism to the petals. And these are the very final touches that I'm doing. So I'm adding in with the liner brush, I'm adding in some of the brightest brights that I'm going to put on the painting. And really just refining anything, cleaning anything up that I need to. This one was a lot of fun to do, and it wasn't too difficult. The petals it wasn't a ton of petals that you had to do, and the lighting was perfect for it. So I suggest you give it a try. I think it would be a lot of fun. Any beginner could do it. Make it your own style. Do it however you want. Take it as far as you want. I just really hope that you give it a try. And if you do, on social media, use hashtag BozArtTutorials so that I could see the results. So these are the final highlights that I'm doing. I'm using pure white. However, I go back in and blend these out quite a bit so it doesn't end up being pure white. I want to make sure I get my reflective lighting in there, so I'm using Magenta for that. That really adds to the realism effect. And then putting in my final dark areas, making sure my values and details are exactly where I want them. And this just about wraps up the painting. I hope you enjoyed this, and please leave a like and comment below, and I hope you subscribe, and I'll talk to you next week. Thank you.